Continuing where I left off, chapter 16. Kutuzov, accompanied by his adjutants, rode at a walking pace behind the carbineers. After going for a half a verst in the rear of the column, he stopped at a solitary, deserted house, probably at one time an inn, near the fork of two roads, both of which led downhill and were crowded with marching troops. The fog was beginning to lift, and enemy troops were dimly visible about 2 versts ahead on the opposite heights. Down below on the left, the sound of firing was becoming more distinct. Kutuzov had stopped and was speaking to an Austrian general. Prince Andrei, who was a little behind and intently watching him, turned to an adjutant to ask him for a field glass. "Look! Look!" exclaimed the adjutant, pointing not at the troops in the distance, but down in the hill in front of him. "It's the French!" The two generals and the adjutant reached for the field glass, snatching it from one another's hand. The expressions on their faces suddenly changed to looks of horror. The French were supposed to be 2 versts away, and all of a sudden they appeared right in front of us. "Is it the enemy?" "No." "Yes, look, it is." "For certain." "What does it mean?" cried different voices. Below them, to the right, not more than 500 paces from where Kutuzov was standing, Prince Andrei saw with his naked eye a dense column of French soldiers moving up to meet the Aspirants. "This is it. The decisive moment has come. This is my chance," thought Prince Andrei, and striking his horse, he rode up to Kutuzov. "The aspirants must be stopped, Your Excellency," he cried. But at that very moment, a cloud of smoke overcast everything. Firing was heard close by, and a voice not 2 paces from Prince Andrei cried in naive terror, "Brothers, it's all up!" At this cry, as at a command, everyone began to run. Confused and ever-increasing crowds rushed back to where 5 minutes before the troops had marched past the Emperors. Not only would it have been difficult to check this mob, it was even impossible not to be carried back with it. Bolkonsky only tried not to be separated from Kutuzov and looked around, bewildered and unable to grasp what was happening. Nesvetsky, his red face wrathful and looking utterly unlike himself, was shouting to Kutuzov to get away at once or he would certainly be taken prisoner. Kutuzov remained where he was, and without replying, drew out a handkerchief. Blood was flowing from his cheek. Prince Andrei forced his way up to him. "You are wounded?" he asked, hardly able to control the trembling of his jaw. "The wound is not here," he said, pressing the handkerchief to his cheek, "but there." And he pointed to the fleeing soldiers. "Stop them!" he shouted, and at the same time, probably realizing that it was impossible to stop them, he lashed his horse and rode to the right. A fresh wave of the fleeing mob caught him up and bore him back with it. The troops were running in such a dense mass that once caught in the crowd it was difficult to get out. Someone was shouting, "Go on! What are you waiting for?" Another in the same place turned and fired in the air. A third struck the very horse on which Kutuzov rode. Having succeeded with the greatest difficulty in extricating himself from the torrent of men and making his way to the left, Kutuzov, with his staff diminished by more than half, rode toward the sounds of artillery fire nearby. Prince Andrei, trying to keep near Kutuzov, forced his way out of the fleeing crowd and saw in the smoke on the hillside a Russian battery that was still firing and the French running toward it. Higher up stood some Russian infantry, neither moving forward to support the battery nor backward with the fleeing crowd. A general on horseback separated himself from the infantry and rode up to Kutuzov. Only 4 of Kutuzov's suites were left. They were all pale and exchanged looks in silence. "Stop those wretches!" gasped Kutuzov to the regimental commander, pointing to the fleeing soldiers. But at that instant, as if in retribution for these words, a shower of bullets, like a flock of tiny birds, whistled over the regiment and Kutuzov's suite. The French were attacking the battery, and having seen Kutuzov, were firing at him. After this volley, the regimental commander clutched his leg. Several soldiers fell, and a second lieutenant who was holding a standard let it fall from his hands. It swayed, fell, and was caught on the muskets of the soldiers standing nearby. The soldiers commenced firing without orders. "Oh!" groaned Kutuzov, looking around him with an expression of despair. "Bukowski," he whispered, his voice trembling from the consciousness of his age and helplessness. "Bukowski," he whispered, pointing to the routed battalion and at the enemy. "What is this?" But before he had finished speaking, Prince Andrei, choked by tears of shame and rage, had leaped from his horse and was running to the standard. "Forward, lads!" he shouted in childish, shrill voice. "It has come," he thought, seizing the staff of the standard, and relishing the whistle of bullets which were evidently aimed at him. Several soldiers fell. "Hooray!" cried Prince Andrei, and scarcely able to hold up the heavy standard, he ran forward, fully confident that the whole battalion would follow him. And indeed he ran only a few steps alone. One soldier followed, then another, till the whole battalion had run forward shouting, "Hooray!" as they overtook him. A sergeant of the battalion ran up and took the standard, which was swaying from its weight in Prince Andrei's hand, and was instantly killed. Prince Andrei again seized the standard, and dragging it by the staff, ran on with the battalion. In front of him he saw artillerymen, some who were fighting, while others, having abandoned the cannons, were running toward him. He saw French infantrymen seize the artillery horses and turn the cannons around. Prince Andrei and the battalion were within 20 paces of the guns. He heard the insistent whistling of bullets overhead, and the moans of soldiers who were falling to the right and left of him. But he did not look at them. He looked only at what was going on in front of him, at the battery. He now saw clearly the figure of a red-haired gunner with his shako-knocked Ari pulling one end of the cleaning rod of the gun while a French soldier tugged at the other. He distinctly saw the distraught, infuriated expressions on the faces of those two men who were obviously not aware of what they were doing. Why can't they be about, he wondered, as he looked at them. Why doesn't the red-haired gunner run since he is unarmed? Why doesn't the Frenchman bayonet him? He won't get away before the Frenchman thinks of his bayonet and runs him through. Another Frenchman, with his gun a-tilt, did in fact run up to the struggling pair, and the fate of the red-haired gunner, who had triumphantly secured the rod and still did not realize what awaited him, was about to be decided. But Prince Andrei did not see how it ended. He suddenly felt as though one of the soldiers near him had bludgeoned him on the head with all his might. The worst of it was not the pain, but that it distracted him, preventing him from seeing what he had been looking at. "What is it? Am I falling? My legs are giving way," he thought, and fell on his back. He opened his eyes, hoping to see how the struggle between the gunner and the Frenchman ended. He wanted to know whether the red-haired artilleryman had been killed or not, and whether the cannons had been captured or saved. But he saw nothing. Above him, there was nothing but the sky, the lofty heavens, not clear, yet immeasurably lofty, with gray clouds slowly drifting across them. How quiet, solemn, and serene, not at all as it was when I was running, thought Prince Andrei, not like our running, shouting, fighting, not like the gunner and the Frenchman with their distraught, infuriated faces, struggling for the rod. How differently do those clouds float over the lofty and infinite heavens. How is it I did not see the sky before? How happy I am to have discovered it at last. Yes, all is vanity, all is delusion, except those infinite heavens. There is nothing but that. And even that does not exist. There is nothing but stillness, peace. Thank God. Chapter 17. At 9 o'clock, the right flank, under Bagration's command, had not yet gone into action. Unwilling to comply with Dokhorov's demand, then he commenced the action, and wishing to avert the responsibility, Prince Bagration proposed to Dokhorov that they send to inquire of the commander-in-chief. Bagration knew that at the distance between the two flanks was almost 10 versts, even if the messenger were not killed, which was quite unlikely, and were to find the commander-in-chief, which would be exceedingly difficult. He could not get back before evening. Bagration cast his large, sleepy, expressionless eyes over his suite, and the boyish face of Rostov, whose heart was throbbing with excitement, was the first to catch his eye. He sent him. "And if I should meet His Majesty before I find the commander-in-chief, Your Excellency?" asked Rostov, with his hand to his cap. "You can give the message to His Majesty," Dokhorov hazily interposed. After he was relieved from the line, Rostov had managed to get a few hours' sleep before morning, and felt cheerful, resolute, and fearless, with buoyant movements, confidence in his luck, and in that frame of mind in which everything seems possible, pleasant, and easy. All his hopes were being realized that morning. There was to be a general engagement, and he was taking part in it. Not only that, but he was an orderly officer to the most valiant general, on top of which he was being sent with a message to Kutuzov, perhaps even to the Tsar himself. It was a bright morning. He had a good horse under him, and his heart was full of joy and happiness. After receiving his orders, he gave his horse the rein and galloped along the line. At first, he rode along the line of Bagratión's troops, which had not yet come into action and were standing motionless. Then he came to the region occupied by Uvavrov's cavalry, and here he noticed activity and signs of preparation for battle. Having passed Uvavrov's cavalry, he distinctly heard the sounds of cannonading and musketry ahead. The fusillade were growing louder. Now, in the fresh morning air, he heard not 2, 3 reports at irregular intervals as before, followed by a cannon shot or two, but from the slopes of the Pratzen hills came repeated volleys of musketry, interspersed with such a frequent booming of cannons that at times one could not be distinguished from the next as they blended into the general rumble. He could see puffs of musketry, smoke coursing down the hillsides as if chasing one another, clouds of cannon, smoked, floating in the air and melting into one another. From the glint of bayonets visible through the smoke, he could also distinguish moving masses of infantry and thin lines of artillery with green caissons. Rostov stopped his horse for a moment on a hillstalk to see what was going on, but however much he strained his attention, he could neither make out nor understand what was happening there. Men of some sort were moving about in smoke. Lines of troops moved back and forth, but why, who they were, and where they were going it was impossible to discern. These sights and sounds, far from inducing in him any feeling of dejection or misgiving, rather stimulated his energy and determination. Go on, give it to them," was his mental response to the sounds he heard, and again he put his horse to a gallop and rode along the line, penetrating farther and farther into the region where the army was already in action. How it will be there, I do not know, but all will be well, thought Rostov. After passing some Austrian troops, Rostov noticed that the next section of the line, the Guards, had already entered into action. So much the better. I shall see it close, he thought. He was riding almost along the front line. A group of men came galloping toward him. They were on Uhlans, returning in disorder from the attack. As he passed them, Rostov could not help noticing that one of them was covered with blood, but he galloped on. That's no affair of mine, he thought. He had not ridden many hundred yards after that before. He saw to his left, across the entire width of the field, an enormous mass of cavalry in dazzling white uniforms, mounted on black horses, and trotting straight toward him and across his path. Rostov put his horse to full gallop to get out of their way, and he would have gotten clear of them had they continued at the same speed, but they kept increasing their pace so that some of the horses broke into a gallop. Rostov heard the thud of the hoofs, the clank of their weapons coming nearer and nearer, saw their horses, their figures, and even their faces more and more distinctively. They were our horse guards about to charge the French cavalry that was advancing to meet them. The horse guards were galloping but still holding in their horses. Rostov could now see their faces and hear the command. "Charge!" shouted by an officer putting his thoroughbred to a full gallop. Fearing to be crushed or swept into the attack on the French, Rostov galloped along the front as fast as his horse could go, but was still not in time to pass them. The last of the horse guards, a huge pock-marked man, scowled fierce at seeing Rostov, with whom he must unavoidably collide directly in front of him. The guardsman would certainly have thrown over Rostov and his Bedouin. Rostov felt how small and weak he was beside this gigantic man and horses. And had it not occurred to Rostov to flourish his whip before the eyes of the guardsman's horse, the heavy black horse, 16 hands high, shied and laid back its ears. But the pock-marked guardsman drove his enormous spurs into him, and the horse, lashing its tail and stretching its neck, flew on faster than ever. Hardly had the horse guards passed Rostov, then he heard them shout, "Hooray!" and looking back saw their foremost ranks mixed up with some foreign cavalry with red epaulets, undoubtedly the French. He could see nothing more, for immediately afterward cannon commenced firing from somewhere, and everything was enveloped in smoke. At the moment that the horse guards passed him and disappeared in the smoke, Rostov was uncertain whether to gallop after them or to go where he was sent. This was the brilliant charge of the horse guards that amazed even the French. Rostov was appalled to hear later that all of that mass of huge, handsome men Of all those splendid rich young officers and cadets who had galloped past him on the horses worth thousands of rubles, only 18 survived this charge. Why should I envy them? I'll have my chance. I may see the Tsar at any moment now, thought Rostov, and galloped on. When he came up to the foot guards, he became aware of cannonballs flying over and about them, not so much because of the sound as from the uneasiness he noticed on the soldiers' faces, and the unnatural martial solemnity of the officers. Passing behind one of the lines of a regiment of foot guards, he heard a voice calling him by name. "Rostov!" "What?" he called back. "What do you think? We've been in the front line. Our regiment attacked," said Boris, with the happy smile seen on the faces of young men who had been under fire for the first time. Rostov stopped. "Really?" he said. "Well, how was it?" "We drove them back," said Boris, becoming talkative in his enthusiasm. "Can you imagine?" And he went on to describe how the guards, having taken up their position and seeing troops before them, mistook them for Austrians, till they suddenly realized from the cannonballs fired at them by those troops, that they were in the front line and must have gone into action unawares. Rostov started to go without hearing Boris to the end. "Where are you off to?" asked Boris. "To His Majesty with a commission." "There he is," said Boris, thinking Rostov had said His Highness instead of His Majesty. He pointed to the Grand Duke standing 100 paces from them in a helmet and tunic of the Horse Guards, who, with raised shoulders and knit brows, was shouting something to a pale white uniformed Austrian officer. "But that's the Grand Duke, and I've been sent to the Commander-in-Chief, or the Tsar," said Rostov, and was about to spur his horse. "Count! Count!" shouted Berg, no less excited than Boris, as he ran up from the other side. "Count, I want wounded in the right hand," he said, showing his hand bound in a blood-stained handkerchief. "And I remain at the front. Count, I hold my sword in my left hand. All our family, the Wallenbergs, were knights." Berg said something more, but Rostov rode off without wanting to hear it. Having passed the guards and an unoccupied area, Rostov followed the line of reserves to avoid again getting into the front line, as he had done with the Horse Guards' charge, and made a wide circuit of the place where the hottest musket fire and cannonade were heard. All at once he heard firing quite near, in front of him and behind our troops, where he could never have expected the enemy to be. What can it be, Rostov wondered? The enemy in the rear of our army? Impossible, he thought. And suddenly he was seized with a terrible fear for himself and for the outcome of the whole battle. Whatever it is, he reflected, there is no riding around it now. I must look for the Commander-in-Chief here, and if all is lost, it is my duty to go down with the rest. The farther he rode into the region beyond the village of the Pratzen, which was crowded with a diversity of troops, the stronger grew the feeling of foreboding that had suddenly come over him. What does it mean? What does it mean? Whom are they firing at? Who is firing? Rostov kept asking Russian and Austrian soldiers who were running in chaotic crowds across his path. God only knows. They killed everyone. We're done for, he was answered in Russian, German, and Czech by men in fleeing mobs who understood what was happening as little as he did. A number of wounded men passed along the road. Oaths, cried, moans, mingled in general hubbub. The firing subsided, and only later did Rostov learn that the Russian and Austrian soldiers had been firing at one another. My God, what does this mean? And here, where are any moment the Tsar may see them? But no, these must be only a handful of scoundrels. It will soon be over. It can't be that. It can't be, he thought, only to get past them quickly. The idea of defeat and flight was inconceivable to Rostov. Though he saw the French cannon and French troops on the Pratzen Heights, on the very spot where he had been told to look for the Commander-in-Chief, he could not and would not believe that. Chapter 18. Rostov had been ordered to look for Kutuzov and the Tsar near the village of Pratzen, but neither they nor a single commanding officer was to be found there, only disorganized, crowds of various kinds of troops. He urged on his already tired horse to get quickly past these crowds, but the farther he went, the more disorderly they were. The highway on which he had come out was teeming with calashes and vehicles of all sorts, with Russian and Austrian soldiers of all arms, some wounded and some not. This whole mass droned and swarmed in confusion under the ominous sound of cannonballs flying from the French battery station on the Pratzen Heights. Where is the Tsar? Where is Kutuzov? Rostov kept asking everyone he could stop, but from no one could he get an answer. At last, seizing a soldier by the collar, he forced him to reply. Ah, brother, they all bolted long ago, said the soldier to Rostov, laughing for some reason and breaking away. Leaving The soldier, who was evidently drunk, Rostov held up the horse of an orderly or groom of some important personage, and commenced questioning him. The man informed him that the Tsar had been driving along the very road about an hour before in a carriage going full speed, and that he had been seriously wounded. "That cannot be," said Rostov. "It must have been someone else." "I saw him with my own eyes," said the orderly with a self-satisfied smirk. "I guess I ought to know the Tsar by now, after all the times I've seen him in Petersburg. There he sat in the carriage, pale as pale could be, and those 4 black horses were really flying. Holy saints, how they thundered past! I should think by this time I know the Tsar's horses, and Ilya Ivanitch. I don't suppose Ilya would be driving anyone but the Tsar." Rostov let go of the horse and was about to ride on when a wounded officer passing by spoke to him. "Who is it you want?" asked the officer. "The commander-in-chief. He was killed by a cannibal, hit in the chest while with our regiment." "Not killed, wounded," another officer corrected him. "Who, Kutuzov?" asked Rostov. "Not Kutuzov, but what's his name?" "Well, it's all the same. There are not many left alive. Go that way, over there to that village. All the commanding officers are there," said the officer, pointing to the village of Horsterdek, and he walked on. Rostov rode at a walking pace, not knowing to whom he was going or why. The Tsar was wounded, the battle lost. It was impossible to doubt it now. He rode in the direction that had been pointed out to him, seeing in the distance a turret and a church. What need was there to hurry? What was he to say to the Tsar or to Kutuzov, even if they were alive and not wounded? Take this road, your honor. That way you'll be killed straight off," a soldier shouted to him. "That way you'll be killed." "Oh, what are you talking about?" said another. "Where is he to go?" "That way is nearer." Rostov considered and then went in the direction where they said he would be killed. "It's all the same now. If the Tsar is wounded, should I try to save myself?" he thought. He rode on to the place where the greatest number of men had been killed while fleeing from Pratzen. The French had not yet occupied that region, and the Russians, those who were unhurt or only slightly wounded, had long since abandoned it. All about the field, like heaps of manure on well-kept plowland, lay the dead and wounded, 10 or 15 to every couple of acres. The wounded had crawled together in 2s and 3s, and one could hear the distressing cryings and groans, which sometimes seemed feigned to Rostov. He put his horse to a trot to avoid seeing all these suffering men, and he felt afraid not for his life, but for the courage he needed, and which he knew could not withstand the sight of all those unfortunates. The French had ceased firing at this field strewn with dead and wounded, where there were no longer signs of life, but seeing an adjutant riding across, if they trained a gun on him and fired several shells. The sensation of those ominous whistling sounds and the sight of the corpses all around him merged into a single impression of horror and self-pity in Rostov's mind. He recalled his mother's last letter. How would she feel if she could see me now, he wondered, on this field with cannons aimed at me. In the village of Hosterdek there were Russian troops who, though confused, were retiring from the battlefield in somewhat better order. They were out of range of the French cannon, and the sound of musketry seemed far away. Here, everyone clearly saw that the battle was lost, and said so. No one whom Rostov asked could tell him where the Tsar or Kutuzov was. Some said the rumor that the Tsar was wounded was correct. Others that it was not, and explained the false report by the fact that the Tsar carriage had in fact sped by bringing back the pale and terrified Harsmarshal Count Tolstoy, who had ridden out to the battlefield with the rest of the Tsar's suite. One officer told Rostov that he had seen someone from headquarters beyond the village to the left, and Rostov rode off in that direction, no longer hopeful of finding anyone, but simply to satisfy his conscience. When he had ridden about 3 versts and had passed the last of the Russian troops, Rostov saw 2 men on the horseback who had stopped facing a ditch that enclosed a kitchen garden. One with a white plume in his hat seemed familiar to Rostov, the other on a splendid chestnut horse, a horse Rostov felt he had seen before. rode up to the ditch, spurred his horse, and giving it the rein, jumped lightly over it and into the garden. Only a little earth from the bank crumbled on the horse's hind hoofs. Turning sharply, he again jumped the ditch and deferentially addressed the horseman with the white plume, apparently suggesting that he should do the same. The rider, whose figure seemed familiar to Rostov, and on whom his attention was fixed, shook his head and made a gesture of refusal with his hand, and by this gesture Rostov recognized his lamented and idolized sovereign. But it can't be he, alone in the middle of this empty field, thought Rostov. At that moment Alexander turned his head, and Rostov saw that beloved features that were so vividly imprinted on his memory. The Tsar's cheeks were sunken, he was pale and hollow-eyed, but the charm and gentleness of his face was all the more striking. Rostov was overjoyed at seeing him. He knew that he might indeed, that he ought to, go straight to him and give him the message Dokharov had ordered him to deliver. But as an enamored youth is benumbed, trembles, and dares not utter what he was spent nights dreaming of, and timorously looks about seeking help, some chance of delay or flight, as soon as the longed-for moment he had arrived, and he was alone with her. So Rostov, now that he had attained what he longed for more than anything in the world, did not know how to approach the Tsar, and thousands of reasons why it would be inexpedient, improper, and impossible came to his mind. How can I? It's as if I were glad of an opportunity to take advantage of his being alone and despondent. It may be unpleasant, even painful, for him to see a strange face at such a sorrowful moment. Besides, what can I say to him now, when my heart stands still and my mouth feels dry at the mere sight of him? Not one of the countless speeches he has addressed to the Tsar in his imagination recurred to his mind now. Those speeches, for the most part, had been composed for quite different circumstances, to be spoken in moments of victory and triumph, preferably when he laid on his deathbed, dying of wounds, when, after receiving the Tsar's thanks for his heroic defeats, he expressed to him in words the love he had already proven in deeds. And then, how am I to ask the Tsar about his orders to the right flank when it is 4 o'clock in the afternoon and the battle is lost? No, I certainly must not approach him. I must not intrude on his reveries. Better to die 1,000 deaths than to risk one angry look or his disapproval, Rostov decided, and with sorrow and despair in his heart, he rode away, continuing looking back at the Tsar, who still stood in the same attitude of indecision. While Rostov was thus reasoning with himself and sadly riding away, Captain Von Toll happened to ride up to the same spot, and seeing the Tsar, went straight up to him, offered his services, and assisted him to cross the ditch on foot. The Tsar, feeling unwell and wishing to rest, sat down under an apple tree, and Von Toll remained beside him. From a distance, Rostov saw with envy and remorse how Von Toll spoke warmly and at length to the Tsar, and how the Tsar, evidently weeping, covered his eyes and pressed Von Toll's hand. And I might have been in his place, thought Rostov, and hardly able to restrain his tears of pity for the Tsar, he rode off in the utter despair, not knowing where he was going or for what purpose. His despair was the greater for feeling that his own weakness was the cause of his grief. He might have, not only might have, but ought to have, gone up to the Tsar. It was a unique opportunity of showing him his devotion, and he had not taken advantage of it. What have I done, he thought, and he turned his horse and galloped back to the place where he had first seen the Tsar. But now there was no one on the other side of the ditch. Only some wagons and carriages were passing by. From one of the drivers he learned that Kutuzov's staff was not far off, in the village to which the baggage train was going. Rostov followed them. In front of him walked Kutuzov's groom, leading some horses and comparisons. Then came a cart behind which walked an old bandy-legged domestic serf in a sheepskin coat and peaked cap. "Tit! Hey, Tit," said the groom. "Well," responded the old man absently. "Tit, go thresh a bit." "Oh, the fool," said the old man, and spat angrily. Some time passed in silence, and then the same jokes was repeated. By 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the battle had been lost at all points. More than 100 cannons were now in the hands of the French. Przebysky and his corps had laid down their arms. The other columns, having lost about half their men, were retreating in disorganizing mobs. All that was left of Langeroon's and Doctorus's forces were crowded together in confusion on the dams and banks on the ponds near the village of August. By 6 o'clock, the only firing to be heard at the August dam was a heavy cannonade directed at our retreating forces from the numerous batteries of the French ranged on the slopes of the Pratzen Heights. In the rear guard, Doktorov and others rallying some battalions continued firing at the French cavalry who were pursuing our troops. Dusk was falling. On the narrow August dam, where for so many years the old miller used to sit in his peak cap peacefully angling, while his grandson, with his shirt sleeves rolled up, played with the wriggly, silvery fish in the watering can. On that dam alone, which for so many years Moreans in shaggy caps and blue jackets has peacefully driven their 2-horse carts loaded with wheat to the mill, and dusty with flour that whitened their carts, had driven back again on the same narrow dam, among wagons and cannons, under horse hoofs and between wagon wheels, now huddled men with faces distorted by the fear of death, crushing one another, expiring, stepping over the dying, killing one another, only to move on a few steps to be themselves killed in the same way. Every 10 seconds a cannonball plopped down, compressing the air as it flew over, or a shell burst in the midst of that dense crowd, killing men and splattering blood on those standing near them. Dolokhov, wounded in the arm, and going on foot with some dozen soldiers of his company, he was now an officer, and his regimental commander on horseback, were the sole survivors of that entire regiment. Carried along by the crowd, they had got wedged into the approach to the dam and jammed in on all sides because a horse in front had fallen under a cannon and the crowd was dragging it out. A cannonball killed someone behind them and another fell in front, splattering Dolokhov with blood. The crowd, squeezing together and desperately pressing forward, moved a few steps and again stopped. 100 paces more, and I'm sure to be saved. Another couple of minutes here, and it's certain death, each man was thinking. Dolokhov, who was in the middle of the crowd, forced his way to the edge of the dam, knocking down 2 soldiers on the way, and ran out on the slippery ice that covered the mill pond. "Turn this way," he shouted, leaping over the ice, which creaked under him. "Turn this way!" And he cried to the men with the gun. "It's holding!" The ice bore him, but cracked and swayed, and it was plain that it would give way in a moment. Not only under a cannon or a number of men, but under his weight alone. Watching him, the men pressed toward the bank, unable to bring themselves to step onto the ice. The general on horseback at the approach to the dam raised his hand and opened his mouth to speak to Dolokhov. Suddenly a cannonball flew so low over the heads of the crowd that everyone ducked. There was a moist plopping sound, and the general fell from his horse in the pool of blood. No one gave him a look or even thought of lifting him up. "On to the ice! On to the ice! Go on! Turn! Don't you hear? Go on!" Countless voices commenced shouting after the cannonball had struck the general, the men not knowing what or why they were shouting. One of the guns in the rear that had just moved onto the dam turned onto the ice. Crowds of soldiers from the dam began to run onto the frozen milk pond. The ice cracked under one of the foremost soldiers, and his leg slipped into the water. He tried to right himself and fell in up to the waist. The nearest soldiers hesitated. The driver of the cannon stopped his horse, but the shouting from behind continued. "On to the ice! Why are you stopping? Go on, go on!" And cries of terror were heard in the crowd. The soldiers near the gun waved their arms and lashed the horses to make them turn and move on. The horses started moving off the bank. The ice, which had held under the men on foot, caved in. A huge fragment with about 40 men on it gave way, casting some of them forward, some back, and they drowned one another as they fell into the water. Still, the cannonballs whistled overhead at regular intervals, splashing into the ice and water, but more often into the crowd that covered the dam, the mill pond, and the bank. And I'm going to leave it off there. Wow, it was a good chapter. If you like it, give it a thumbs up. If you don't, give it a thumbs down. Leave a comment below. Subscribe or keep watching, and I'll see you in the next episode. Thanks for watching. Bye.